The year is 1945, and the Soviet Union has marched across Europe to push back the German army. Soviet soldiers now have control of most of the eastern half of Europe, including countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and even the eastern part of Germany. The Cold War begins as the two ideologically opposed sides, America in the west, the Soviet Union in the east, try to gain more power than the other, turning one-time allies during World War II into enemies. Though America had went on to try and contain the spread of communism in other parts of the world, like Korea, Vietnam and Cuba, it did little to actively interfere in Eastern Europe. While the Soviet Union had been communist since 1917, and therefore had had many years to make sure its people kept quiet, did not complain, and did what they had to do, Eastern Europe had not. So, the first major event of Unit 6 is the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Hungary is a little bit of a unique case because it was very, very Catholic, and when communism came in, religion was banned. And so all of these people who obviously felt very powerfully connected to their religion and the church, which was based in Rome, would have been very angry and disappointed about that. In fact, the people of Hungary had been connected to the west of Europe and Western ideas for a long time. Before the First World War, Hungary was part of a large empire called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a first world country, it was very developed. And so the people of Hungary thought that if they protested enough, the UN would step in and help them. In 1953, the UN was just coming out of a conflict in Korea where they had stepped in to help South Korea. So why wouldn't they do the same for Hungary? There was lots of poverty, and as we can see here on the causes, Stalin had just died in 1953 as well. So this is a bit of a turning point for the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Protests begin. Lots of students are involved in those protests. The government at the time wants to keep things calm, and so Nagy, the leader of the government, he asked Soviet soldiers to leave. He wants to try and renegotiate some freedom for his people. He announces new freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and he says that Hungary are going to leave the Warsaw Pact. Of course, if the Soviet Union allowed this to happen, then they would look very weak. They would look very weak against America, especially when America had managed to stop North Korea from taking over South Korea. So the Soviet Union really needed to win this. As a result, they invade, there are tanks on the street, it's very bloody, and they stop Hungary from making any changes, and they keep control of Hungary as a communist state. This is also a turning point for the West, because the fact that they didn't interfere in Hungary sets a precedent so that for the future people know they're probably not going to interfere in the rest of Europe either. Now, after this, 1961, the Berlin Wall comes up. Remember what I had already told you about Berlin. The Soviet Union is really angry about what happened with Berlin. Berlin was the one good place in their part of Germany where they should have been able to take reparations. And even that got divided. So in the end, they missed out on lots of the good areas, the industrial areas of East Germany, where they should have been able to get reparations. Worse still, lots of the people who were in East Germany at the time, especially some top scientists. I can give you an example of a scientist. There was a guy called Wernher Von Braun. This is a man who helped create some of the most deadly rockets in the Second World War. He goes on to work with America. He gets American citizenship, and he builds the first rocket that puts Neil Armstrong on the moon. Germany is full of top scientists like this. And anyone who's still in the eastern part of Germany, many of them, they want to get out. Lots of them do. And they can easily leave by going from East Germany into West Berlin and jumping on a plane. And so the East Germans decide that they can't afford this. They call it a brain drain. Everybody's leaving. They build a wall. They wall off West Berlin, and they stop anybody from being able to leave. It also means that the people inside of West Berlin, they're trapped. Okay, planes can still come out and in, just like it happened during the Berlin blockade. Cars can come in, but it's like a separate country, which is what it is. They totally become split off and separated. The Americans are using West Berlin as a bit of a base for the CIA. They're trying to launch propaganda from there against the Soviets, against communism. They're also, at that same time, okay, the Korean War's just finished. There is an ongoing situation in Vietnam, and the Cuban Missile Crisis is about to blow up into something much bigger. Remember, Cuba had become communist in 1959, so this is all happening at the same time, and you need to be able to show that you understand the links between all these different events of the 1960s. As a consequence, Germany split up, cut off. It just shows how serious this is. I particularly, if you haven't already looked at it, this article here about the German schoolboy, it shows you how lots of people didn't have access to radio, they didn't have access to information from the West, and so they were using secret radios to listen to the BBC in the UK. West Germany was very, very far away from East Germany, not geographically, but in terms of their ideas and the way those people lived. Later in the 1960s, 1968, we have the Prague Spring. Now, the thing about Prague and Czechoslovakia is that, a little bit like Hungary, this had been a very developed country for a long time. And it was a little bit strange that it became communist, because most of the other communist countries, they hadn't industrialized as quick as some of the Western countries. But Czechoslovakia already had. And so it was a very free country. It had previously been very liberal, and people had lots of freedom to do what they wanted. And so by the 1960s, there are lots of people who think, well, why can't we go back to the way things used to be? Again, particularly students. They start to protest. And this guy, Alexander Dubcek, he's a reformer. He wants to improve the country for his people. And so he creates a series of changes in order to do that. One of the problems is, he knows what happened in Hungary in the 1950s. And he knows that if he decides to break away from the Soviet Union, well, maybe he's going to get invaded. At the same time, he didn't particularly disagree with communism. He was a socialist. He thought socialism was a good thing. The actual idea behind socialism, sharing what we've got, sharing our riches amongst all our people, that was something that he thought was very important. And so it wasn't his intention to break away from the Soviet Union. He starts to have meetings with the Soviets. He wants to let them know, we want to reform, we want to give our people a little bit more freedom, but we don't want to break away from communism. We don't want to break away from socialism. In the end, he couldn't convince them enough. The leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Brezhnev, he puts in place his doctrine, the Brezhnev doctrine. We cannot allow anyone to even think about slightly breaking away from our system. It makes us look weak. And this is right at the height, the middle of the Cold War. The Soviet Union could not afford to be made weak. Now, as long as everything was going well for the Soviet Union in terms of their economy, they could do this. And anyone who was protesting, well, they could be silenced, because they were always going to be a minority. Now, this starts to change when we come to the 1980s, because towards the end of the 1970s, the Soviet economy starts to decline. They start to have less money. And so all of these red countries, China, the Soviet Union, Vietnam even, Cuba, their economies are linked together. And when one does badly, they all start to do badly. The Soviet Union economy starts to decline, and so does China's, and so does everyone else's, or at least not grow to the extent that it should have. A couple of other things happen at the same time. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979 because they want to put in place a communist government. They thought that this war would be very quick, but in the end it lasted for 10 years, and it cost the Soviet Union so much money, really so much money. It was very bad for their morale as well. It made them look weak. The cost of their products was increasing. Workers' salaries in the Soviet Union weren't increasing. Tensions with America in terms of military tensions, in terms of armaments and how much nuclear weapons each side had, were becoming increasingly tense. And so if the Soviet Union wanted to keep up the Cold War with America and they wanted to stay equal, they had to keep spending money on their military as well. But where was the money coming from? Fighting the war, developing their military, continuing to create new nuclear weapons. They just could not keep up with America, and so their economy starts to decline massively. As people become poorer, they protest. They want things to change. And so the guy who becomes the leader of the Soviet Union by 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, he wants to put in place two reforms. Perestroika, an openness, giving people freedom of speech and political rights in the hope that it would stop them protesting, and glasnost, which was going to open up the economy to capitalism. It was going to allow people to open businesses. It was going to be less controlled by the government, and he hoped that it would turn the economy around and it would help the Soviet Union start to grow again and people's living standards would increase. However, once you start to do this in the Soviet Union, then you have to do it everywhere else. And so every time anyone had tried to reform previously, like in Czechoslovakia or in Hungary, they'd immediately been stopped by the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union couldn't stop them anymore. And so Poland is a really good example of this. In 1981, a trade union movement called Solidarity emerges. Because all these people in Poland, they're struggling just like in the Soviet Union. Their wages are not growing. They haven't got any money. Their standard of living is pretty poor, especially when they see what's happening in Germany and France and how people who live there, their standard of living is increasing enormously. And so they began to protest. It begins in the Gdansk Shipyard. And by the way, Gdansk, we should all remember, was originally called Danzig. So there's another link there between some of the stuff we studied from the Second World War. Hitler wanted Danzig, you might remember. It was part of the Polish corridor. Anyway, this guy, Lech Walesa, he is leading the Solidarity movement, and all he wants is higher wages and greater freedoms for workers, for people in Poland. The government is not going to have it. They arrest many of the leaders, and they put pressure on people like Lech Walesa to keep quiet. If he does anything wrong, he's going to be locked in prison. In fact, he even received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1983 for what he does, and he can't go and collect it because he thinks that if he does, the government will arrest him. After the reforms put in place in the Soviet Union in 1985, the Polish government has to do the same. So now Lech Walesa has to be listened to, and he starts to get lots of support from ordinary people in Poland, well beyond the trade union movement. By 1989, after having lots of discussions with people like Lech Walesa, the government in Poland decides to hold elections, and they decide to allow different political parties to stand. Lech Walesa's political party, Solidarity, they stand in the election and they win it by a landslide. And the government is so shocked, they didn't believe that any other party would have a chance. They thought that they were still powerful enough to win. They had another election the year after, and this time for president of Poland. Lech Walesa stands and he wins. And in 1990, this guy who just 10 years before was working in a shipyard, just as a normal worker, begins to protest and is now the president of a free, non-communist Poland. So just as in Hungary, the power of religion was really important because at the same time, a Polish cardinal, so he's a member of the Catholic Church, he's high up in the Catholic Church, he becomes Pope and he speaks out in favour of Poland and what's happening in Poland. The Polish people are very Catholic, they listen to him, and all of this contributes together to lead to reform in Poland. And so, by the time we get to 1991, basically all of these red countries, not all of them, but many of them, have stopped communism. They're no longer communist. Even Vietnam there we can see on the right hand side, China over on the east, North Korea. They're still communist, but at various times they've been very different to what they used to be. Vietnam, for example, okay, it's still a socialist government, but actually it's got lots of capitalism within its economy, and that all changes after perestroika and glasnost. So the key ideas to take from this whole unit is that the Soviet Union grows in power, but it can only maintain its power as long as the people are happy and they're not protesting. And the people are only going to stay happy and not protest as long as the economy is good. And this lesson comes up in so many other periods of history. Whenever the economy goes wrong and people start to become poorer, that's when they show how unhappy they are, and that's when they start to protest. So by 1991, these reforms hadn't worked, people continue to demand more freedom, the Soviet Union is over, it collapses, it breaks up, so now we have Russia, which is a capitalist country. Germany unites, beginning from 1989 when the Berlin Wall gets broken down. Poland, now a member of the EU, is a capitalist country. And some of the very few communist countries still left, but to a much lesser degree than they were, are Cuba over near America, Vietnam, China, North Korea. But that's about it. There are other, Albania for example is still a socialist country, but they're not really communist in the way they used to be. Okay? So what we're going to do next week is we're going to go through practice assessment. Now I'm going to look at the essay questions first before I look at the source question. Remember, any single essay type question we have in our exam begins with a 4 marker. It's a describe question. And for a describe question, we just have to make 4 simple points. Secondly, we get an explain question. We need to give 2 P paragraphs here. Why did something happen? How did it happen? In this case, why was the Berlin Wall built? 2 reasons why it was built, with examples to back that up, evidence and an explanation. Finally, we get the 10-mark evaluation question. We need to give 2 reasons on either side, 2 P paragraph reasons, and we need to have a conclusion at the end where we say how far do we agree. So what were the causes of the Prague Spring? Well, can we think of 4? We can actually give 2 with a little bit of extra detail, and that will give us 4 marks. And why was the Berlin Wall built? 2 reasons, explained. The Solidarity Movement was the main reason for the end of the Cold War. How far do you agree? Well, in some ways you're going to agree. Think of 2 reasons why you would agree with that. 2 reasons why you wouldn't. Maybe something else was the main reason for the Cold War ending. And then your conclusion. Your final conclusion shouldn't be I agree or disagree. You've got to find yourself somewhere in the middle. When it comes to the source question up here, how far does source 7 make source 8 seem surprising? I've put my sample answer here, and you've got to say that in some ways it is surprising. Source 7 does make source 8 seem surprising, but on the other hand, it doesn't. You've got to think about the fact that this is maybe not reliable. You've got to think about the provenance of the sources, and you've got to compare that with the content of the sources. So, for example, we can see that source 7 here, made by Alexander Dubcek's government, is saying something very different to source 8. But source 8 is written by a Soviet news agency. The Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, and therefore, of course, considering it's controlled by the government, they are going to say something different to what the Czechoslovak government are going to say. Because the Czechoslovak government, led by Dubcek, didn't want them to invade. Okay? And then just like always, we're doing an evaluation, and so your final paragraph for your source question can be short, and it just needs to say, well, therefore, overall, I'm a little bit surprised, or I'm not very surprised, because actually, even though the content of the 2 sources is different, when I think about who created them, I can see why one of them might not be telling the truth. I will give you a new assessment, but it will be the same type of questions. I'm going to give you some of these essay type questions, and I'm going to give you one source question. I'm going to try and keep the sources fairly straightforward, but it's really important that you read them, you take some notes, and you make sure you understand the sources before you begin your answer. The 3 essay questions, they should only really take us 30 minutes to answer altogether. Maybe 20 minutes we spend on our evaluation and 5 or 10 minutes on our explanation question and a few minutes on our describe question. Okay, so we'll leave it there. Again, ask me any questions, get in touch, let's talk about some of this stuff, and I will get your marks back to you within a couple of days, and we can start looking at what changed.